Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So, for anyone who follows my streams, I have a buddy by the name of Bill, who makes a lot of suggestions about a lot of builds. Bill, if you're watching this, and I know you will, this one's for you. And also, I'm going to dedicate this whole series for Bill, and we're going to call this Bill's Builds of the Week, with an emphasis on the word builds. So for this one, we're actually going to be looking at the... Now, I'll preface this. These builds are just like completely test. So like the idea behind this is taking weird combinations, weird gear, shit that just shouldn't work, and trying to throttle it up. More or less, we're going to be doing this near the end of League when we're not so interested in making like good builds. Not to say that Bill's suggestions are not good, but so far they've been about average. So, you know, it's not too bad. It's been very expensive though, and this one's no exception to that. So basically what we're looking at for this episode is Unseen Blade. Now, what this is, and I'll explain it a bit more very shortly. As you can see, it's flying around all around me. Unseen Blade is actually attached to a weapon called the Hidden Blade Ambusher. Now, this came into the league a few leagues ago. Ultimately hasn't really been used, but what it does give you is trigger level 20 Unseen Strike every 0.5 seconds while phasing. Now, how do we get permanent phasing? Well, there's two ways to do this. You could have a Mage Blood and run a Quartz Flask. I wouldn't suggest that option because that's very, very expensive, and for the damage output that you get, be it you might get really good defenses depending on the flask you run, it's not really going to be worth this considering this build doesn't really keep up with most other builds. But hey, it's a T16 Alch-Go mapper, and it's not too bad, and we'll have footage very shortly about it. Anyway, so the way that we get permanent phasing the old-fashioned way is we simply just run Quartz Infusion and a Raider Ascendancy, and as you can see, I've leveled up a whole Raider for this one, which gives you permanent phasing. So that basically gets rid of that entire problem, and there's no longer any downside to the build. Now, what that means is you can't run armor. Like, potentially you could run armor, but you really can't run armor. So how do we build defenses on this? Well, basically, from a defense perspective in this build, this is actually using maxed out capped evasion and capped spell dodge as well. Like, spell dodge is at 73%. I've got to level it up a few more levels, and we'll get to capped spell dodge. And then basically we use evade and, you know, every which way to get to 90% evasion. Now, it's massively hit and miss. And this is why I generally, and probably there's somebody out there who can build a better evasion build than me. I am not an expert in evasion builds. We can clearly see that with the amount of armor I stack onto my jugs, and I mainly play jug. But it works. It works for the best part, be it probably dies on average about the normal amount of times you die in a map. I wouldn't know because I play Delve, and I really don't die that often. It's an event when I die, not something that is in every sort of other map sort of scenario. Now, that being said, what do we need to do to make this work to sort of get this to tick? So two of the reasons why this build is so expensive and to get this build off the ground is, number one, you need a fucking Crystalized Omniscience, which is like 9 to 10 divine, and this is like a couple months or whatever into the league. Is that practical? Not really. Is it cool? Yes. What does it do? Gives you huge amounts of alley penetration. So basically, I do like, 71% cold pen, which for this is pretty damn good. Now, the other thing that it means is you have to stack Omniscience, which is a little bit sort of finicky. And if you do want to try this build, by the way, if you think you can make it better than me, and you probably can, then follow the tree exactly, because yeah, this is pretty much optimized to get Omniscience to work so that everything can work in the build. Now, the other thing we need to do, because this would only allow you to have a 4 socket, well, to get to the damage levels, and by the way, with what's it called? Greater Volley, I should say, and there's a gem switch out here too, but we'll talk about that soon. We get to like 3 million per projectile, and we have 5 projectiles they hit in a volley. And then they have the potential to chain as well, and that comes from the, or they pierce, and for some reason, oh, they chain based on the sniper's mark, sorry, that we have on mark hit, or mark on hit setups for, and I'll talk about the setup with that very shortly. So the damage isn't terrible, like it does T16s, and also this is predicated on the fact of that you need to be able to freeze enemies as well. So if you don't freeze enemies, then, you know, it's a bit shitty. Pardon me, my nose always gets itchy when I do a video. I don't know why. So to sort of juice this build up, the second thing that's going to cost you a lot is you need a Squire. Now, these are pretty cheap this league. I think I paid like 16 or 17 div for mine, something like that. Like cheap, a better part of the word. So like already looking at this, we're looking at close to 30 div just to get 2 items to get this build started. Not to mention everything else that's in the build that costs currency as well. So the actual item to get it started, like the dagger, is worthless. It's basically a 1C item. If we do this, it's a 1 divine item for some reason, probably because it's rarity. But everything else is, you know, relatively expensive, to be honest with you, to get it going. Like, we've got a Bottle of Faith on this. We've got a, you know, Stibnit Flask that gives us increased evasion. We've got a replica Shroud of Lightness to get this working. We got a Heat Shiver with a Hatred mana reservation efficiency roll. We've got a Watcher's Eye that's worth 1 div. You know, we've got this triple cluster here, which actually wasn't too expensive, but we're stacking pressure points and basics of pain medium clusters to get this cranking. So there's a fair bit of sort of gear that goes into getting this working. So basically from that point, you're able to auto cast projectiles. Now, usually it's at a 0.5 cycle, so it's got a tick rate of 0.5. I've actually got mine down to 0.4, and the way that I've done that is I've also crafted a belt, which has increased cooldown recovery, 12% as a max cap, as what I can get on a mastercraft on the bench. And then all of my searching eyes have 2% cooldown recovery rate applied to them, and cold damage on hit. Now, the other things that this build does is obviously a raider, so it stacks frenzy charges, so you'll need to stack up as many frenzy charges as you can. In the tree, I have about 8 stacked, and this variation, which is 4 points behind, 4 points behind, I think, 6 points behind. It's only got 7, and I know that sounds like I'm saying it's only got 7, but that in the more power charge, the more frenzy charges you have, the better. Now, the other thing that this does is it does use Nightblade, which also does huge amounts of crit multi, so it gets up to like 800 to 850% crit multi as it sort of scales up, and it gets close to 100% crit as well. So that's one of the other things that we do a lot of damage with. And then beyond that, with some of the other defenses stacked on it, I've also got like nearly 100% bleed avoidance for everything without having purity of elements in the build. And realistically, this only runs 5 auras, being Hatred, Grace, Herald of Ice, Precision, and Vitality. So yeah, there's a lot of shit going on in this build. So I guess in the next part I'll talk about the tree, and then we'll do this like a normal build sort of guide scenario, and I'll explain the build a little bit better. Now, overall summary of the build, do I think that this is a good build? Depends on your definition of good build. For the amount of currency that I've put into this so far, it just wouldn't be worth it. Like, you can build a decent jug build, like an RF jug, that's going to be tankier and be able to take down Maven and everything. This cannot take down Maven in the state it's in. It just needs much more sort of like min-maxing to get it way, way higher in the damage stat. But that being said, like, it's got potential that it could. If someone took this and really juiced it up, like if you're throwing mirrors at this would work. But as it is right now, it does T16s. It can do other stuff. I'll run it through some footage shortly. Actually in the next part of the video, and or after we get past the next part, sorry. And you can have a look, but I wouldn't recommend this build. And I'm going to put in big capitals, I do not recommend this build in the description below. Anyway, let's talk about the mechanics, and then we'll go into the gearing, spell setups, and then I'll show you some footage at the end, or you can skip to it in the timeline as well, because everything will be timestamped. Okay, so mechanics of the build, and this POB will be in the description. So it does use a switch out of hypothermia and greater volley. So when you boss, you're going to run hypothermia, and actually more precisely, you're going to run anomalous hypothermia. And this is actually going to get you close to 5 mil per projectile on the enemy. So can it take down in-map bosses and stuff like that? Yes, it can. But you need to switch that out as you play it. For now, we're going to be running Greater Volley, which you just run your standard Greater Volley. You don't need to run anything else. Now, configuration-wise. So, yep, Frenzy Charges, does use Life Tap, does use Onslaught. Funnily enough, it has Life Tap. Though it wouldn't make a difference even if you didn't have it. Now, phasing, you've always got phasing up because you're the Raider with the phasing ascendancy. Are you elusive? Yes. Are we leeching? Yes. This is coming from our Feed the Fury, so we're leeching. Flasks, we generally always have flasks up. Consecrated Ground, we have Bottle of Faith, so yes. Nearby enemies are 10 because we're running a Lunaris and you're generally surrounded. Have you killed recently? Yeah, more or less, but the damage that you've got coming off this isn't huge. Now, skills of Pierce 3 times, yes, and the reason being is that I do have increased damage while Pierce, or if you run Long Shot, sorry, that's going to increase your damage. Actually, no. There was another stat I was working on with this. Yeah, okay. Alright. Scratch that, but yes, we have pierced at least 3 enemies, so yes, it does do a little more damage. Is the enemy moving? They predominantly will be, but it doesn't really matter. Is the enemy on full life? Well, if they're on full life, you do more damage to them, so we have that ticked. Are they ignited? I do believe I'm running a Cinder Swallow, and the reason being is I get a bigger increase to damage than running any other type of flask. So yes. Enemies chilled? Yes, at least like 10%, but they're probably chilled for more. If the enemy is frozen, and there's a good chance it's 30% freeze, and then if you run hypothermia, 90% chance freeze, then you do double the amount of damage to the enemy, which makes this build pretty good for taking down bosses in that sort of perspective. Now, is the enemy exposed to cold? Makes no difference. This is coming from the gloves as well. So cold exposure, gloves. We have cold exposure on, and that potentially allows us to scale up this point in here to do more damage with cold exposure, though it's saying 50,000 DPS, so it's not really worth it at the end of the day. Is the enemy on consecrated ground? Yes, they are. Now, if you had one of the rings that applied covered in frost, you could get another 200k DPS, but whatever, you don't really need that. And it is Guardian and Pinnacle boss damage. So everything in here is legit working, and the build actually functions. It's mainly the defenses that are a bit scuffed. But it does have an effective hit pool of 47,000, which is pretty average for like a vast majority of builds. And we do get to close to 40% evasion and essentially max spell dodge, because spell dodge caps out at 75. But anyway, we'll talk about the gearing next, and I'll show you the logic behind the build. Okay, so gearing, obviously the whole build is built around the Hidden Blade, and that's so we can have Unseen Strike, which is what you can see popping off on the screen. We run Heat Shiver as well, so this also gives you gain 100% of cold damage, extra fire damage against frozen enemies, and then vice versa, the effect for extra fire damage. We run a Squire, and what the Squire does is it allows you to link up the skill gems from your main hand weapon, and so that's what I've done here. And it also gives you the ability, if you've got an inbuilt skill into your main hand, to do a technical 7 link. Now, if you've got a really good claw, like in this case, I'm most likely going to turn this build into a Frostblade build and run claws. But yeah, that's basically how the Squire works. Now, unfortunately, and this is what I found from playing with the Squire is not like a put it on and your build will work scenario. It's really good for Arakali's Fang builds, but there's a lot of builds it just doesn't really work with, and that's what I'm realizing from this process. But it's a fun process of learning how this item sort of synergizes with different builds. That being said, it can be really good if you have like built-in Elder rolls for different skill gems in your main hand weapon, and you can make like technical 10 links if you had the currency to do it. The next thing, obviously, we're running Crystalized Omniscience with Charisma. And then we're running a replica Shroud of the Lightness. It has to be replica so we can socket 6 of these jewels in. And these jewels will have cooldown reduction built into them, which allows us to cast this or throw this unseen blade out a lot more frequently. Then on my rings, I've got strength and dex highly rolled. The reason being is that's so I can get more omniscience. So you need to stack attributes to get omniscience, and that allows you to use weapons. So when you see the build, you'll actually see that it doesn't really have very much intelligence, strength, or dexterity. It's because the Crystalized Omniscience converts the attributes to omniscience, which allows you to use gear similar to like your standard stat attributes, but also allows for elemental penetration, which is why a lot of Raider builds and a lot of Ellie builds use it, because it's super powerful at stacking elemental pen, as opposed to running like pen jewels, which take up a whole jewel socket. Now I am running a Circle of Fear, and I do have a Grace implicit roll on it, but basically this is increased cold damage while affected by Herald of Ice and buff effect. And then gloves, I have Fractured Suppressed spell skills, increased crit chance for attacks, and then I also have physical damage converted to cold damage, and that increases my damage significantly because this is basically doing all cold damage. And then my belt, I have attributes, resistances, LE damage to attack skills, because Unseen Blade is an attack skill, pardon me. And then Dark Ray Vectors, I've got Corrupted Boots with increased spell suppress on them. And this gives me +1 to Frenzy charges at the end of the day. And they're just really good if you're running Frenzy builds. They tend to be pretty commonly used. Unless you can get boots with an implicit with Frenzy on it, with an additional maximum Frenzy charge, then use that. Flasks, I've got Diamond Flask, Eternal Life Flask, Bottle of Faith, Stibnit for more evasion, and Cinder Swallow for the Ignite proc and also for onslaughting. Okay, so gem setups. Helm, Flame Dash, Mark on Hit Support, Life Tap, and Sniper's Mark. The reason why I've got that Mark on hit, Life Tap is because it's going to keep proccing, and it's automatic, so you don't have to do anything. By the way, this has like no extra keys. You literally just have to Flame Dash around, and main click is your Steel Skin, so this is fundamentally like a one-button build almost. And then basically we have, in our weapon, we have increased critical strike support. We've got Nightblade, we've got Ice Bite, we've got Awaken Elemental damage with attacks, we've got increased critical damage support and Greater Volley, and then we'll switch out Greater Volley with Anomalous Hypothermia when we verse any bosses. And this is going to almost perma-freeze them, and then basically make it so you can smash them. And buff your damage up to like 4 to 5 million DPS, which is good. And then in the gloves, I've got Grace, I've got Herald of Ice, I've got an Enlighten level 3 and Hatred. And then in my boots, Vitality, Arrogance, Steel Skin, and Precision. I do reserve life for it because life is worthless on this build. You basically just keep stacking evasion and then hope to fuck you don't get hit. And that's basically how it works. Okay, skill tree. So you start from obviously the Raider here, whatever that's called. I can never remember the base ascendancy for whatever, Raider ascendancy. And then you go to Finesse. You want to pick up these nodes to Intuition, Flash Freeze, and then we'll come up. I picked up all these nodes first to get to Acuity, and then Precision Reservation Mastery, because that's going to allow you to basically get precision working without huge amounts of reserve. Then extra frenzies. The dual socket here needs to be a Thread of Hope with a large roll, or a large ring, and then we're going to pick up Quick Step, One with Nature, Primeval Force, Piercing Shots. We'll also want Split Shots, and then Force of Nature, and this is going to sort of buff up all of your spell, spell suppression, and also everything else that you need to sort of buff up your acrobatics, which you'll take basically like by the time you get to level 8. You don't want to take that straight away. Then we'll take Heartseeker. This increases crit, 25% increased crit multi against unique enemies. You'll need that so you can hit harder on single target enemies. And then Survivalist. I also picked up Inveterate for spell suppression. And then Spell Suppression Mastery, you want critical strike chances increased by a chance to suppress spells. So as you increase your spell suppression, your crit chance goes up. And then we pick up From the Shadows. And we also want Elusive, also grants 40% crit multi when you're supported by Nightblade. This is going to synergize with Nightblade. And then Depth Perception, and then all the way up to getting Backstabbing, and then you want to cull on Culling Strike. Critical strikes have Culling Strike, because we have like almost 100% crit, we cull everything, which makes this a pretty okay Autobomber. And then we come back down and we run Lethality, we run Fleetfoot, we run Entrench. And then we also want to run, because we're running Omniscience, we need to run Utmost Swiftness with Attribute Mastery, 5 dex per allocated Mastery passive skill. And then we come down, grab Fangs of the Forest. We want 40% physical damage converted to cold. And then I do have these attribute points here, which are a little bit of a waste, but I need them to run Omniscience. And then we come down, we grab Discipline of the Slaughter. This gives us minimum frenzy charges and damage per frenzy charge. Charge Mastery gives me 3% increased damage per any of your charges. +1 to Frenzy with Savagery, and then another Jewel Socket. And then on our large cluster jewel, we come down here, we get Feed the Fury, Martial Prowess, and Calamitous. Now, I haven't picked up Calamitous yet. This all just increases your damage at the end of the day. And then you run 2 medium sockets, which is Basics of Pain and Pressure Points on both. This will get you crit up. And then Watcher's Eye I have has increased 8% increased evade chance with Grace and crit multi with Precision. And then all my sockets on my tree are crit multi, global crit multi, and one-handed melee weapon crit multi and attributes. And this deals with Omniscience, and it also allows me to stack crit multi up to like 800 to 850%, which is where my damage comes from. Now, ascendancy-wise, you're going to want Quartz Infusion first. Avatar of the Veil, this gives you 50% base elemental avoidance, which is pretty useful. And then Way of the Poacher, and then Avatar of the Slaughter, and that pretty much gets you over the line. If you could get like Ricochet or something like that in the cluster, in the Forbidden Jewels, do that, but I wouldn't recommend spending that much currency on a build like this. It's already expensive enough, just depends on how far down the pipe you want to go. But that's it for the setups, for the skills. Anyway, that's a quick run through of this build. Again, I wouldn't recommend this build. Way too expensive for what you get out of it. But anyway, enjoy the B-roll at the very end and the gameplay. And until maybe episode 2 or the next video I put out, have a good one.